Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today at the Prevention in Practice Using Case Studies to Discuss Sexual Abuse and Exploitation webinar. My name is Anika Zalmi, and I'm joining you from the Ontario Council for International Cooperation. I serve as their Community Engagement and Gender Equality Specialist, and so it's my honor and pleasure to be able to convene events and capacity building sessions like this for the sector. Before I hand it off to our colleagues from Digna, I want to do a quick land acknowledgement, acknowledging that OCIC's office sits on the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I myself am joining from the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe on Tubro Wampum Belt and Dish with One Spoon territory. And I also recognize that all of us are joining from different places across Turtle Island, across different treaty lands, as well as unceded territories. For me, when I think about land acknowledgements, I like to reflect on how we can move beyond simply just naming the land on which we live, work, and play, and actually embrace the land acknowledgement as a framework to engage in whatever since the session we're in this case, today's webinar. For me, I think through a land acknowledgement as this self-reflection or this constant reminder to myself that I do sit and live, work, play on territory and land that was historically Indigenous and that was never given permission to be colonized. And therefore, it is my responsibility as someone who benefits from colonialism to use my knowledge of where I am and the Indigenous communities that continue to live here as a way to engage in today's session, to learn and take back lessons that can allow me to be a better ally and stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities. So as you go through this session, I invite you not just to think about what land you're on, but also who's not just whose land you're on, sorry, but also how you can do better and show up better as a ally and in solidarity with the Indigenous communities closest to you and even beyond. With that, I would love to right now hand off the session to Tracy Foster from Digna. Before I do that, actually, I'm going to do just a summary of the Gender Equality Hub. So for those of you who are not familiar, today's session is a training session in the series of capacity building events that the Gender Equality Hub at the Ontario Council for International Cooperation runs. The Gender Equality Hub is a community of practice that brings together different practitioners, experts, and even folks who may not have a lot of experience but are interested in gender equality in the international cooperation space. We bring them together to learn more, share capacity, share best practices, and do better in the sector. I will share more information and follow-up emails, but if you are interested and to learn more or to join the GE Hub, please feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to add you to the mailing list appropriately. But with that, I will actually hand it off to Aislinn from Digna to do a quick overview of Digna, and then we will get right into it. Aislinn, over to you.
Thanks, Anika. So hi, everyone. My name is Aislinn Rowan. I'm just going to start sharing my screen in a second. Okay. So welcome to today's session. As Anika said, this is a joint partnership between Digna and the OCIC GE Hub. And we're very happy to be here with Tracy Foster, who is on the Digna Advisory Committee and also the co-lead of the training working group for Digna and has put countless hours into the work of Digna. And I'll explain in a second who we are and what we do. Before I do that, I will do my own land acknowledgement, just adding on to what Anika said. I'm personally joining you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, or colonially known as Ottawa. And to put it into this land acknowledgement into context for our topic of discussion today, we're going to be talking about the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. And so with my land acknowledgement, I'd like this to serve as both a moment of respect to the Indigenous peoples on whose land we live and work, as well as a moment of reflective discomfort. We can recognize, among other things, that as Canadian organizations who work in international cooperation and supported by the Government of Canada, put efforts towards the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse globally, that this should rest on solid progress towards addressing the record of sexual exploitation and abuse of Indigenous women and girls and other folks across Turtle Island. So with that, I'll give you a brief overview of the agenda for today's session. We'll have a short introduction by me about Digna and some of the concepts that we'll be talking about today. And then at which point I'll pass it over to Tracy, who will lead us through the objectives for the session, some small group work with case studies, which is our main activity for today. There will be a large group report back from the breakout rooms, and a discussion of the issues that arise around PSEA, and then some closing comments and ways to be further involved in this case studies initiative. So if we could start with some introductions, we'll just use the chat function. Unfortunately, in Zoom, it's not easy to do rounds of introductions, and we don't want to take up too much time. So if you could just put your name and location in the chat, and if you want to share with us your favorite food, that would be just interesting to know. While I have the microphone, I'll say that I'm, again, Aislinn from Ottawa, and my favorite food, that's a tough one. I'm going to go with ice cream because it's the first thing that popped into my head. Not sure that qualifies. I mean, it is food, but it is mostly dessert. But so if everyone else wants to just pop in the chat, let us know who you are, where you're from. You can also share your organization and role if that's helpful as well. Dan, lasagna is a great choice as well. Okay, looking at this all, I won't read it all out loud, but very interesting to see where everyone's joining from and what everyone's favorite food is. Sorry, I was reading fruit salad at this when I was saying that. Okay, lots from Ottawa, lots of lasagna, chocolate, sushi, pasta. Love it. All right, well, I'll let people keep doing that if you haven't had the chance yet. And I'll move on to our next slide. Actually, so yeah, before we start, a quick advisory message. So we will be talking about sexual exploitation and abuse in relation to sexual violence. And so I just want to give you the chance to know that it is a sensitive topic, and we know that. So we encourage you to participate to the extent you feel comfortable. Take a break if you feel it's needed. And if this session brings up things that you would like to talk about, you have a couple options. One is to use the coping mechanisms that work for you best, which could be seeking support from a trusted colleague, friend, or family member. But Digna also provides psychosocial support from professional counselors free of charge. And I'll actually put that link in the chat if it'll let me copy it off of this. Nope. One moment. So if at any point you would like to seek counseling, you can access it. You can email or call either of these two people, and they will provide you the support you need. And not to worry, they don't reveal your identity, and it is free of charge. Okay, so what is Digna? Some of you, I know I can see some familiar names and faces, so this will be a review, but for those of you who haven't interacted with Digna before, I'll give a quick introduction. So Digna, if we start with the actual word, Digna is Latin for worthy. And this name was chosen because Digna supports the Canadian international development and humanitarian sector to be worthy of the trust that is placed in them by Canadian citizens, by our government, and by the millions of people who are supposed to benefit from Canadian international development assistance around the world. So that's why the name Digna was chosen. It is not an acronym, it is just one word. We get that a lot. But what do we do? So our mission is to promote organizational change and gender responsive best practices to prevent and address sexual exploitation and abuse in the delivery of international assistance. And we'll go through some definitions in a moment in case any of those words aren't familiar, or in this context, you're not sure what they mean. And so what our approach is really taking an intersectional approach, partnerships. So through partnerships with OCIC, we've partnered with OCIC, lots of different of the councils across the country, but also globally, we have worked with other networks that are doing similar work as well. And really the focus is on participation and power. And what that means is the participation of program participants, communities that organizations work with, shifting the power balance so that the risk for sexual exploitation and abuse is diminished. What we're not, because we need to clarify sometimes as well, we don't provide support to survivors of sexual violence. We don't intervene in cases or allegations. We don't have a reporting mechanism, or we don't encourage people to report to Digna. People are supposed to report through their own organizational channels if they have suspicions or cases of sexual exploitation and abuse that they want to report. And we also aren't a compliance or enforcement mechanism. So many organizations who you probably work for have signed on to the Leaders Pledge or get funding from Global Affairs Canada, each of which comes with its own set of rules or things that organizations have agreed to comply to. Digna won't be enforcing those in terms of following up with organizations or reporting to the government or anything like that. And we are a small group, so if at any point you want to stop and ask a question, we do have time for that. So please, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat, whatever you like. But I'll move on to my next slide, but feel free to stop me as we go. So what are we talking about today? I'm going to go through 3 different definitions before handing off to Tracy. The first is sexual exploitation. So sexual exploitation is any actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power, or trust for sexual purposes. So this can include, but isn't limited to, profiting monetarily, socially, or politically from the sexual exploitation of the persons of concern. Any questions about that? We can come back to it if ever it's unclear. Sexual abuse, which we often say sexual exploitation and abuse, and we can differentiate them here. So sexual abuse is the actual or threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature, whether by force or under unequal or coercive conditions. So the difference here is the actual or threatened physical intrusion, and whereas the exploitation is where someone benefits monetarily or otherwise from the sexual acts. And the last one, which we don't, it's not in our acronym of PSEA, sexual harassment, but I do want to provide a definition. And by the definitions that are used in the international cooperation community, set out by the UN in particular, Sexual harassment is not sexual exploitation or sexual abuse, SEA. And there's a reason for that. Sexual harassment refers to prohibited conduct in the work context and can be committed against staff or related personnel. And again, this definition comes from the UN. So in that context, sexual harassment primarily describes prohibited behavior against another staff or related personnel, which could also include nationals of the host state if we're talking about international cooperation. And what that could look like or what that entails within the workplace involves any unwelcome sexual advance, requests for sexual favor, verbal or physical conduct, or gesture of a sexual nature, or any other behavior of a sexual nature that might reasonably be expected or be perceived to cause offense or humiliation to another. When such conduct interferes with work, it's made a condition of employment or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So I hope those definitions were helpful. If you have any questions, again, please feel free. So we won't be talking about sexual harassment today, but we thought it would be important to leave that definition up there and make sure that everyone has a clear understanding. So if everyone is clear, I will pass the microphone to Tracy Foster.
Thanks so much, Aislinn, and thank you everyone for making the time and joining us this afternoon. It's an honor and a privilege for us to spend some time with you. I'm really pleased to be here, but you'll realize as the session unfolds that I get to do very little and you get to do a whole bunch. Hopefully what you get to do is have a chance to engage with a couple of different scenarios or situations, to consider them and think about the challenge and just the issues in terms of trying to determine what you might do in a particular situation. So as you recognize, Aislinn started off with some definitions that try and give us that sense of what sexual exploitation is and isn't. But even so, when you see the case studies, you'll see again that often when you come across actual case scenarios, they're not necessarily cut and dried. And so what we're hoping is that this afternoon will give you an opportunity to engage with this challenging topic, but in engaging with it, to have an opportunity to share your thoughts and ideas with others in a smaller group. And to be incredibly self-serving, this session is a wonderful opportunity for us to actually gather your wisdom and maybe get some help from you for a specific project that we're undertaking for Digna. So as Aislinn mentioned, I'm a member both of the advisory committee and the Digna training working group. And one of the projects that we felt as a training working group would be really important for the sector is to develop some different case studies. What we'd found in the different kinds of trainings that we'd run over the past sort of couple of years is that people really appreciated having kind of more knowledge, more information, having definitions, understanding what sexual exploitation is and isn't. But there was something about having actual scenarios or case studies, specific situations to think about that just kind of gave them a different opportunity to learn and a different way to engage with the topic. And so we had felt that there's some amazing training that's being offered over the summer through Digna, but we wanted, in addition to the training, to be able to offer organizations case studies that they could use to promote discussion and dialogue within their organization, and perhaps to refine their approach, their procedures, and develop their internal framework to address PSEA. We realized that one part of that work was developing the case studies themselves, but actually perhaps an even more important part of that work is putting them together in a document that will actually allow people to use the case studies kind of in a hopefully safe, responsible, but also useful way. So we're actually doing a bit of a test drive of two particular case studies with you today, and are really anxious to gather your feedback and gather your input and wisdom around those case studies. So thank you in advance for helping us with this important piece of work. And as it says, this is a pilot and we really welcome your input. And there are some different ways that you can help us in a much more direct way that we'll highlight a little bit later on if you're interested. So in terms of the objectives for today, so we've got two specific case studies. We deliberately chose two that are perhaps a little more subtle, a little subtle in some ways, a little more sort of nebulous or challenging in terms of the situations they present, to really promote that discussion and give you that opportunity to share your thoughts and ideas and learn from each other. So two different case studies that we hope highlight some of the different sort of issues in both kind of preventing or protecting from, but also potentially in responding to sexual exploitation and abuse when we come across it. Given your expertise and background and your membership as part of the Gender Equality Hub, we really saw some value in terms of giving you an opportunity not just to look at the case studies in terms of what you can glean about sexual exploitation and abuse, but also to look at the case studies with that intersectional analysis and with that intersectional lens. And also to have an opportunity to think through some of the different power imbalances that the case studies raise and that we know inevitably exist in just about every organization. And as an extension of that sort of discussion and thinking, hopefully then gather some ideas and tips and share some thoughts together about how you can continue to work effectively and sensitively with the communities that you serve. So those are the big global overarching objectives for our session. So as I mentioned, two different case studies. So the way that this is going to work is we're going to divide you into breakout rooms. So I think given the size of our group, there'll probably be about 4 breakout rooms. So 2 breakout rooms will look at one of the case studies and the other 2 breakout rooms will look at the second case study. And we want you to have some reasonable time for discussion to sort of connect a little bit as a group and to share your sort of thoughts and ideas and wisdom. So we'll give you 20 minutes. What we'd ask is that you identify a note taker / spokesperson. So we're hoping that the person will do double duty in terms of capturing some of the essence of the discussion that happens in the small group, but then is also willing to come back to the large group in 20 minutes or so and do a little bit of a report back and give us a flavor of the discussion and perhaps bring forward some of the key points from your discussion. And if there are particular concerns or questions that arise in your discussion, to bring those back and share them in the large group so that we can again glean the kind of the experience, the insight and the wisdom of the whole group when we bring you back. Aislinn and I will probably pop in to the different groups at some point. So we'll try and visit with at least sort of 2 of the groups. So you'll hopefully see one or other of us sometime over the next 20 minutes. So let's just take a look at the case studies. Before I show the case studies, I want to get you thinking about the discussion questions. You can see that at 3:30 or so on a Tuesday afternoon after a long weekend, these are some pretty weighty questions. So we understand that you may not necessarily go through all of the questions, but it might be that your discussion centers around 1 or 2 or 3 of the questions that your group feels are particularly important to look at. So all of the groups will have the same set of questions to consider, but as I said, there'll be 2 different case studies and you'll be looking at one or the other. So we are asking you to look at the case study and just going back to those definitions that Aislinn shared at the outset of the session, have you just thinking for yourselves, given those definitions, what are the PSEA issues that seem to be raised in this case study. And then I'd ask you as a small group to have a little bit of a discussion about, from the few lines in the case study, what do you think is known and not known? Because often when we look at a case study, we fill in all kinds of blanks in the case study. We sometimes have created a much richer situation just by either pulling on experience or situations that we've come across or known, or just even the way our mind works or the way our imagination works. So I will invite you just sort of in your small group to just have a discussion about, based on these few sentences, what do we think is known or not known about the situation? And then we invite you to use that kind of background you have as gender equality advisors and think about what are the issues that come up when you look at with that intersectional lens. How does the case study sort of, shift or change when you apply that perspective? We'll also invite you to consider what are the power issues or the power imbalances that are raised in that scenario. Does the case study connect to the way that you work with the communities that you serve? So does it have resonance in terms of those communities that you serve and the particular ways you have of working? And then if you're able to get to it, and some groups might just skip back sort of all the way down to this step, what would you suggest as next step? So if you became aware of that situation, what do you think you might do? So those are the questions, and we are going to have those available to you on a Google Doc so that whoever is the note taker will have those questions in front of you. So we'll move forward and take a quick look now at the case studies. So you can see that there are two of them and they're quite different. I won't read out the case studies at this point because, as I mentioned, you'll be looking at only one or other of them, but they are quite different. So there's case study one that you see that sort of centers around a note in terms of how you become aware of something, and then case study two, which is seems to be sort of situated in perhaps a country where your organization is working. So what we're going to do now is move you into the breakout rooms. We are, as I mentioned, going to give you 20 minutes for this. So we hope that we recognize it's still not a lot of time, but you will have a chance to have some kind of discussion. And we'll leave it up to your small group to settle on those questions that you feel will have the most meaning for your discussion. So I believe that Aislinn is going to move us into the breakout rooms. And as I mentioned, either Aislinn or I will pop in and visit with you at some point over the next few minutes.
Welcome back.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone's back. Great. Tracy, over to you.
All right. So thank you so much. I got to visit with two groups and just great, really thoughtful, thought-provoking discussion. So really appreciate your willingness to engage with that. And just a comment sort of as we were coming back to the large room, someone said, wow, these are difficult. They're difficult situations. And so, yeah, just really appreciate you trying to navigate some of the sort of complexities and trying to sort through what was known and what was unknown and sort of extrapolating what you can from not very much information. So just to remind us both, because of course you were focused on just one of the case studies. So the first case study had you in the position of having just delivered a gender equality session for all staff in your organization that seemed to be well received. Session evaluations are positive, and it appeared that participants found the session useful and thought-provoking. One of the evaluations includes an unsigned handwritten note in the comments section. The note says, "This organization is not a safe place for women. I have witnessed how some of our male senior leaders treat women, and it is unacceptable. Something should be done about this." That's case study number 1. And case study number 2 had you during a visit to one of your programs. Mohammed, who's one of the drivers, tells you that they regularly pick up David, one of your expatriate colleagues, from a well-known bar in the city, and that he often has a young woman with him. It's rarely the same woman twice. The driver thinks that your colleague is paying the women to have sex with him. The driver asks you what he should do, as he is unhappy about having to drive them, but also is very worried about his job. So I'm gonna, maybe if we can, we'll focus on case study number 1, if that's okay. And Aislinn, if you want to just advance the slide. Yeah, so we're wondering if you can just give us a bit of a sense of your discussion about the case study number 1. And we know that there were 2 different groups having the discussion. And I suppose what we're really interested in is kind of what stood out from the discussion that you think would be useful or important to share with the rest of the group. Serena.
Maybe I'll start as spokesperson for group number 1. We had a really difficult conversation, but I think one that was really productive. And we had a lot of great ideas, and our minds sort of converged a lot on what we wanted to focus on. So I think just to summarize our discussion, in terms of what issues were at play here, I think, we all agree that there was really not a lot of information given, and that it could have been possible that there was exploitation or harassment or abuse going on, or any combination of these all at the same time, just because there are multiple layers of power imbalances here, and power imbalances is something we spent a long time talking about. There's both the issue of gender here, where this is being done by male senior leaders, and also the fact that there's seniority involved creates multiple layers where sort of these issues are playing out. So we agree that a lot was unknown about the situation in terms of who was doing the training, where a lot of the positive feedback is coming from, what this workspace looks like in general. We don't know any characteristics about the workspace because we don't know, what the culture is like there. We don't know what the system for reporting is like there. Although presumably in this case study, because it says you and that you're presenting to your own organization, you might have more of this information. But I think what came about from this discussion about not knowing a lot of the details is that oftentimes the way that you would interpret this issue or go about it is very specific to that particular organization. So we agreed that, if it was bigger, there might be more formal ways to deal with that maybe already exist, where there would be a lot more of like a bureaucratic process almost, but in a smaller organization where everyone knows each other, it might be a lot harder to deal with sort of a big environmental change in response to a complaint. And then the other thing that we talked about a lot in terms of power imbalance is that we noticed that the writer of this note did not reveal a lot of details. They didn't reveal anything about themselves as well. And so we're wondering if in this organization there are, other reasons that there is a lack of information. So maybe this writer is not in a leadership position, doesn't feel comfortable speaking out. Maybe if they were to make themselves known or to be more specific about the situation, they would be putting themselves at risk in terms of their work or their position in this organization. And so I guess we spent some time critiquing the background leading up to this case, as opposed to thinking about what the next steps might be.
Thanks so much, Serena. And I will ask if there are any other teammates from Serena's small group who want to just kind of add anything to what Serena shared and that great summary of your discussion. Anything anyone in the group would like just to add? Sounds like it's perfect and complete as is. So we'll invite the other group now who also looked at case study number 1 to do the same kind of summary. Lisa.
Okay, thanks. We had in a lot of ways, similar discussion to what it sounds like group one had. We talked a lot about power imbalances as well. And we talked about, again, about the organization, like this idea, not having a lot of information. So I guess there were some assumptions that we made on our part, or questions we asked around, is it a safe space to talk about these issues and raise concerns? You know, it could be an issue of confidentiality. Does the organization even have a system to report? It doesn't seem necessarily that they likely have a system, or if they do, maybe it's not considered confidential or effective. We talked about not knowing exactly who the women are, and so not knowing, is it, you know, sexual harassment, is it exploitation, abuse? We don't know. We also sort of picked up on the language around like our male senior leaders, plural, and so it doesn't seem necessarily that the organization has a culture of preventing SEA, or maybe it's not effective if they do. We don't know. We talked a lot about some of the things that we don't know. We talked about the language of treat women, which is very vague and very sort of encompassing. It could be anything, like different types, which will require different types of severity and different types of action. So it's really challenging to know what to do, and what sort of process or consequences there should be if we don't know what the behavior is or what those actions are. We talked a little bit about some different intersectional lenses around the power imbalance around gender, but we also considered potentially age and other intersectional factors like race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, the language of religion. Again, because we don't know a lot of details, but looking at these various factors of who tends to be in senior positions in organizations and who's not. So these were just things that we were sort of thinking through. We talked a little bit about next steps. First of all, we said it would be important to thank all the participants for their feedback and do that first. So sort of encouraging this idea of like coming forward and sharing feedback, and then finding a way to like reach out and speaking about confidentiality, so that people feel safe to share information, let them know why it's important, and sort of like having some sort of survey or sort of identifying like the scope of the issue, and the importance of focusing on the issue at hand and avoid focusing on doing some sort of investigation that would identify the person who wrote the note. It's not about that. It's about sort of getting at the actual issue at hand and what's going on in the organization and trying to sort that out, because we really want people to be able to feel safe coming forward, that they know that there's confidentiality. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there and see if anybody else from the group had anything to share.
Sounds like you captured everything. So thanks to both of you, and really neat to hear kind of both the similarities in your discussion, but also some of the additional kind of elements of the discussion from one group to the other. What I'll do before we move on to case study 2 is I'll invite the other 2 groups who didn't work on case study number 1 to offer any additional kind of thoughts or insights or observations based on what you've heard from the 2 groups. Alexandra.
Hi, what I will do is, I don't know if there's a whistleblowing platform or an anonymous reporting about anything like PSEA or sexual harassment. I would recommend after the training, try to promote or raise awareness about this whistleblowing platform. So if there's something there that people will feel comfortable to report to through those whistleblowing platforms.
Mm-hmm. So seeing it as a great opportunity, if you've got that platform in place, just to reach out generally as a reminder to everybody that this platform is available. Adriana.
I actually just wanted to reiterate, I think something that was said by one of the rapporteurs that I'm like thumbs upping, which is thanking someone for coming forward, which seems small, but it's huge because it's a huge part of the culture and it's something that we often miss. So just like building the culture where it's getting that feedback is adding benefit to the organization. It's like, it's big.
Yeah.
So it's great that they raised that.
Yeah. And that point that they were making, both, you know, sort of thanking and kind of acknowledging the courage in raising that. And at the same time, the point that was made about really being careful that what you're not trying to do is identify the person who wrote the note at that point. So just the point that came through in their discussion was about the importance of, upholding the confidentiality and the safety of that incredibly courageous person who brings something forward. Yeah. Any other comments or observations about case study number 1 before we move on? Hearing none, then we'll move on and we'll have similar sort of discussion about case study number 2. So you're going to switch your minds now from the note in the evaluation after the training session, and that we're now in the situation with Mohammed, who again, with some courage shares his experience of driving his colleague David. So I think this is probably maybe group number 2, if we could, either group number 2 or 4, if we could have a report back from one of you.
Hi, everyone. This is Mitra from group 2. So we had a pretty good conversation, but weren't able to get to all of the questions. Just a reminder, the case study is that a driver tells us that an expat colleague he often picks up an expat colleague from a bar, and there's often young women with him, and rarely the same woman twice, and he's worried that David is paying the women to have sex with him, and he doesn't know what to do. I think the thing that was quite striking for our discussion, and my group members can jump in as well, was how many unknowns we had. We did spend quite a lot of time talking about the knowns versus unknowns, and the only known that we came out of this conversation with was that David meets women at a bar. We don't know where these women friends of his are taken. We don't know if Mohammed the driver drives them any place. We don't know if the organization has rules about not having staff in a car. We don't know if he's an employee or a contract staff, if the organization has a code of conduct, if that code of conduct applies to him. We don't know if the women are over 18 or under 18. We don't know if they're friends or coworkers. We really don't know much about anything that's going on. What we did talk about was that this is a potential reputational risk issue in the community. If the driver is aware of what's happening with David, it could be that it's something that's shared more widely. And if there are specific concerns around sexual exploitation from the story, it could be very concerning on multiple levels for the women who David is interacting with, upwards onto a more bigger risk for the organization as a whole. And so we talked a little bit about next steps, trying to figure out what kind of reporting mechanism would be, and that this isn't necessarily a story that we would ignore, the story that was disclosed to us as someone in the car, that we would try and figure out if there's any kind of reporting or disclosure mechanisms, and ask for help from our colleagues more senior than us to investigate.
Great. Thank you so much, Mitra. That's a very a great long list of all of the things that aren't known. So you realize how little information really is contained in those few lines. Anything from else from other folks in group number 2 that you'd like to add? All right. Then maybe we could move on to group number 4 and hear from the reporter from group number 4.
Thanks, Tracy. So we discussed, and many of the things that Mitra mentioned, we had already. What I would like to add is we had many not knowns. For example, is David paying the women? Is he having sex with them? Is there a process for in-country staff to raise concerns? Did he receive a safeguarding training when he arrived? What do we know? He lives with different women often. This was reported by Mohammed, one of our drivers. But the most important things I would say are power dynamics, power imbalances in this case, for example, race, gender, nationality, how economic status, assuming he has the needs and the women should be at his mercy, that about David. Hierarchy, the driver is worried about his job. Does David have power over the driver? Could they fire the driver if David would want to? And also there's a passport privilege that puts David on top. So one thing that we were wondering is why is Mohammed driving him after hours? Is that a normal thing? Is that a policy? Should the driver be at David's mercy whenever he wants? So one of our colleagues in the group was talking about an experience in Zimbabwe. She said that expats can be perceived as having more power, so they have to be careful and aware of their privileges and say no. For example, David should not ask Mohammed to drive him from the bar. He maybe should decide to stay and drink at the hotel. Are there clear rules of what is inadequate or unacceptable things? And then we went on to what would you suggest as next steps? Request additional information, answer all the questions that we raised about policies, rules, what's adequate, what's inadequate. And then after knowing all the rules, having a conversation with David to learn his version and then make a decision on what to do.
Wow, great job, both groups, really, really good. So are there observations from the folks who looked at case study number 1? What's coming up for you now about case study number 2? Adriana.
Oh, sorry, I'll give the floor to any other folks. I just had some thoughts, but I'll give the floor to maybe other folks will bring up the exact thoughts I had that I was thinking.
Serena.
I would quickly point out, although maybe I've gotten more than my fair share of speaking time, I would point out that in both of these case studies, the report of potential misconduct is coming from people who seem to not be immediately involved in the issue that they're reporting. So the first one comes from an observer who says they have seen or have witnessed, and the second one is coming from someone who is personally concerned about themselves, but is still witnessing a situation that they don't really have personal responsibility in. And I think that's just an interesting observation, perhaps, about where we can expect these sorts of reports to come from and what that support is often going to look like. But I don't have a lot of other thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really great observation, Serena. And in an earlier version of this workshop that Aislinn and I were working on, we actually were going to get you to look at the case studies and ask you to potentially put yourself in different roles. So you are a gender equality advisor, you are a colleague of these folks, you are the manager of one of these folks. So I think you raise a really interesting point about sort of both proximity, how you become privy to the information, and also how close or how far away you might be from the actual kind of event. So really appreciate that. Adriana, do you want to jump in?
Well, sure, that was great. I hadn't thought of that point, but it's related actually to what you just mentioned, Tracy. A few things that oh, right. Main thing that I saw was, and this comes up in some of the trainings I'm giving too, is the idea of depending on who you are and what you find out, your roles may be different, because some folks in our group came up with the investigation plan right away. And also a lot of folks I train that are responsible for investigations are like fact-finding already. I'm like, no, wait, we're talking about reporting. So you just need to identify, and all the staff in the organization need to know what to look out for to see if it's suspicious. And in this case, there's a lot of suspicions. There could be an underage person, sex work. Yes, it could be legitimate. We can have that discussion. But when we're talking about the principles of in sexual exploitation context with workers, there is a big suspicion of PSEA. So organizations have, people who are managers, their responsibility would be to report a suspicion. So know it's there. And then others would have a responsibility to do more investigating. So we had a big talk about that. So I just wanted to flag that because it often comes up when we're doing case studies, like right away, what happened? And do we know the facts before we actually report? No. There's also the idea that you have to report a suspicion, right? So anyways, that came up.
Yeah, really appreciate that. And so I'm glad we didn't go with the version that we had where we asked you to put yourself, because it sounds like to some degree you kind of explored and experienced that for yourselves. So thank you for that. But really that notion that, what's your remit in the situation will kind of influence sometimes how quickly you need to move, the kind of action that you take, what's possible or not possible. But what I hear in all of the case studies, and I'll invite you to share your thoughts about this, in all of them, what's coming up for me as I hear you discuss them is the importance of that framework that's created in the organization. You talked about codes of conduct, didn't you? You talked about what's the whistleblowing system. How do you maintain kind of confidentiality and safety for whistleblowers? So it's really about the importance of that system. And then the perspective that comes out with the first one, someone made this observation and said the way that the note talks about the male leaders in the organization suggests at least that this is not an organization at this moment in time that really gets the idea of zero tolerance. So again, that whole system approach. I'll get you click forward to the next slide. And I guess we're sort of, for the last maybe 5-10 minutes, we're interested in how this was for you as an exercise, given the idea that you've already experienced, that we gave you the supreme level difficulty scenarios, and we gave you very little, and you had to sort of draw out and kind of sort through so many different elements because they weren't clear and straightforward. So how was this for you as an exercise? Does it raise any new issues or questions that you'd like to be able to address with the rest of the group? The other questions you'll see about, if you're going to use these case studies, so this is very much firmly us wearing the case study project hat, is if you wanted to use these case studies, could you see a way that you might use them? Might you want to adapt or change them? Because one of the discussions that Aislinn and I had in deciding which case studies to use, and from an intersectionality sort of power imbalance point of view, was we wanted case studies that wouldn't inadvertently lead to obvious kind of stereotyping, if that makes sense. So we felt a responsibility and a sensitivity, even in terms of how we framed the case studies for you. So if there are ideas that you have just about how the exercise was for you personally, or if there are thoughts or ideas or questions you have about how you might use case studies to promote discussion in your own organization. Serena.
Maybe I'll just provide some thoughts while some others are reflecting on these questions. One thing that maybe it's jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the things that I really appreciated about this discussion is that there were multiple great breakout rooms talking about each case study. So there was the opportunity to both have your hand at looking at the questions, but there was also the chance to listen to another group that had the same, time to review these questions and came up with different things. I think it just goes to show how, gender equality and dealing with, PSEA is sometimes a collaborative effort and is definitely something that has to be built in by the understanding of a lot of people. In terms of the case studies themselves, I like that it seemed like they were each focusing on one big kind of unresolved issue in terms of PSEA. The first one sort of about anonymity and the lack of details, and the second one about advising someone who has something personal at stake. And when you're not in a position that is sort of like personally responsible to this situation, and yet you are still advising and trying to resolve issues. So I appreciated everything in that sense.
Thanks so much, Serena. And I really would want to amplify the point that you made about just the beauty of the discussion, the more minds, the richer discussion. And as you said, sort of having, two groups looking at the case study and seeing similarities, but also differences. When I'm writing a case study, I've pictured the situation in my mind. And what I love when I use case studies in training is the case studies then take on a life of their own. So when I hear participants discuss the case studies, they add in things or they raise things that I hadn't even thought of, which as the author of a case study blows my mind, but also is very, very neat. So I really appreciate that point about, having sort of almost a focus point for the discussion, but the richness that comes out of that. I'm going to invite, before we go to Anne-Sophie, I'm going to invite Gabrielle. Do you want to speak to the point that you raised in the chat?
Yeah, of course. Obviously in my work at YAG, that's the first thing that we ask when we receive a case. We ask whether it's really SEA or not. And then we ask, is it SE or is it sexual abuse? Because there's a lot of confusion in the sector, but there's also a lot of confusion in our own organization, right? So maybe the very first question in the case study could be, or maybe the last one, it doesn't matter, but it could be a question that could be asked whether it would be considered legally as, or according to the UN definitions as PSEA or SEA.
Yeah, I like that. So it sounds like you're saying that first question that we asked about what PSEA issues does this raise, it almost sounds like you're suggesting maybe circle back on that almost and sort of ask the group at the end of the discussion, having had the discussion, kind of where might you begin to sort of place it in terms of those different distinctions? Yeah?
That's a good idea. Yeah, for sure.
Thanks so much, Gabrielle. And then is it Anne-Sophie? Is Sophie Anne?
Anne-Sophie, yeah. I am a gender equality advisor. So for me, in the case of our organization, I would first sensitize more about PSEA because we are not very advanced we are advancing the process of the system of the PSEA, but we didn't go through much of sensitization in PSEA in our organization. So first I would put the accent on that, and then as a second step, I think using the study cases is very interesting, and I would point out more the gender equality issue. What I want to say is just not put the emphasis of or less put the emphasis of the system of investigation or the system of the PSEA, because there are specific people that are in charge of that. So I would maybe it's the second step, and then the third step, maybe we can involve and go further with the specific PSEA system. But here I would go more into details about the gender equality questions, the questions about power imbalances, and so they can see more concrete examples of what we are talking about, and so they can they can be able or more ease to talk about that later on, or to speak up maybe also.
And Sophie, if I understood what you were saying correctly, it sounds like you're sort of saying, you know, almost be clear perhaps in your mind when you're using the case studies of who your audience is, and kind of almost what their role might be. And I think your point about how much preparation you might need to do before you get to the case studies is entirely valid. So thinking about what are the sort of stages of awareness building before you even get to the case study point. But if I understood you, what you were saying is, you know, if folks aren't in a position to be kind of doing investigations, then sort of ground the activity in sort of what they can do. Did I get what you were suggesting?
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, folks, I'm very conscious of the time. I would love to keep chatting, but I know it's late in the day and probably a long day after the long weekend. So Aislinn and I would love to find a way to keep the conversation going with you. One of the things we would invite you to do, and I think we're going to work with Anika to just follow up with the participants. There is a follow-up survey that Aislinn has created, and she's put in the chat right now. So if you kind of access that, we'd invite you, if you've got additional either ideas for case studies, so it can be a vague idea, or it could be a line or two that we could use to create new case studies. But if you don't have case studies, but you're willing to share your expertise about gender equality, intersectionality, or power issues for the case study project, then we would love to have you reach out to us. And again, hopefully you can get hold of us through the survey. And we'd love to sort of pick your brains at some later date, and we can figure out what that would look like. But it is a key part for us that as part of the case study project, we find a way to do some kind of consultation with folks with your kind of experience. Other than that, I would just really thank you from the bottom of my heart for your willingness to participate in this. Really appreciate the little bits of discussion I got to hear, and then the report back in the large group. And I'm going to hand it back to Aislinn to see if she has a word or two. But thank you so much to all of you for your willingness to engage so fully in the discussion and to share your experience and your ideas and your expertise with us.
Thanks, Tracy, and a big thank you to you for walking us through this process and developing those case studies and the questions. So yeah, as Tracy said, so I've put the survey in the chat. We'll also see if we can send it as a follow-up by email to everybody. But that will be the place to share more thoughts in depth if you would like. Also to reach out to us about potential sharing of case studies or ideas you might have, or if you just want to be part of this project. And if you're looking for other ways to get involved with Digna, please do check out our website. I realize I never shared that, but I'll share it in the chat now, or you can email us at digna.info@cooperation.ca. So we have trainings. Adriana is actually one of our training facilitators for our PSEA summer school, which is going on right now. So we have trainings, we have community of practice meetups coming up. We will have further events in the fall and onwards as well. So please do get in touch if you have questions about PSEA or how to get involved or how to learn more. And with that, I'll pass it back to Anika.
Thank you so much, Aislinn and Tracy. It's such a pleasure, and I learn so much every time I have the honor of kind of co-hosting or coordinating one of these, and I had the opportunity to sit in on one of the breakout rooms, and I was like, wow, I am learning so much. And we're very fortunate to have folks in our sector who are specialists and experts in this to continue to share resources and knowledge. So just to quickly close off the session, recognizing we've only got a couple more minutes, I want to just flag a couple of other resources. So the psychosocial support available document that Aislinn dropped in the chat, as well as the Digna website, both of which I will share via email following this session. And also for those of you who maybe are looking for an example or a resource, or maybe you're part of a small organization that may not have the resources or capacity to develop your own prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment policy, OCIC recently approved and passed our own that you can find on our website, and you can always use as a reference or resource for your own organizations. Once again, I will share that with all of you via email in a follow-up. But before you go, keep in touch. You can find all of OCIC's social media as well as Digna's social media, and please don't hesitate to send me an email at anika@ocic.on.ca or email digna@digna.info@cooperation.ca. But with that, a huge thank you to all of you for joining us for today's session on prevention practice using case studies to discuss sexual exploitation and abuse. Have a great rest of your day.